Welcome back, everyone. For those who've just joined, I'm Oriana Rosa-Royal from Management Today. We will now hear how you can overhaul your company culture and future-proof your business. There will also be time at the end of the session to answer any questions you have, so send them as and when you have them. Let me now hand you over to the Development Director of the BBC News, Katie Lloyd.
Hi everyone, thanks Oriana. You've probably all, or some of you, been on Zoom for hours now, so I hope you've got some caffeine. I'm going to try and just talk a little and then leave some space for discussion and questions, because I know what it's like when you've done lots and lots of sessions on Zoom. But just before I get started, just to say I've been listening into some of the sessions and the one prior to this, and this whole subject of reimagining the way we work, this is something I'm really, really passionate about. And I'm pretty optimistic that we're going to see some positive changes after a really, really difficult year. It was brilliant to hear from Phil earlier at Honest Burger about how they're completely rethinking their business model, from Claire at Vodafone and Louisa about the positive things that have come out of COVID. And I think the BBC for sure, and I know lots of your businesses will all be looking to retain the best out of this really challenging time. And I think the kind of great thing, and I hope that's the thing we're all seeing, is that culture, diversity, well-being, all these areas are moving much further up the agenda for lots of businesses. I think sometimes they had been seen perhaps as softer and more internal things, but I'll talk a bit about that later. So I've been asked to talk a bit about the work I've been leading at BBC around culture and inclusion, and to keep it quite practical. So I've chosen 3 examples to take you through: investing in leaders of the future, how to create culture ambassadors in your organisation, and how to unlock the potential of younger colleagues. Some of you may well be doing some of these things already, and I'm just here to tell you a tiny bit about what we're doing and what's working for us. Hopefully some of it will resonate with you or resonate with some of the challenges that you are facing. So first, a little bit about the BBC for context. We have 22,000 people working for us. Our global reach is 468 million people. We reach 91% of adults in the UK. BBC News rates #1 for impartial news coverage, and on average the BBC is used by 41 million people in the UK every day. I'm mainly in news and current affairs. We have 6,000 people working in the UK and overseas, and you'll be familiar with lots of the programmes we make. You can see a picture there of Emily interviewing Prince Andrew for Newsnight. So you've got Newsnight Panorama, BBC Breakfast, Radio 1 Newsbeat, the World Service, and much more. My role spans culture change, so looking at the behaviours and habits we want to create in order to deliver on our business plan, making BBC News a great place to work. And we're very lucky because the conversation you just heard prior to this was all around purpose. Our people believe massively in the BBC and are hugely motivated by its purpose. And I also lead on leadership development, diversity and inclusion, sustainability, and I run our flagship media literacy project, BBC Young Reporter. So I thought I'd kick off with a thought-provoking quote. You may have seen this before. It's from David Mattin, Head of Trends and Insights at Trend Watching. It says, "There's really no such thing as an internal culture anymore. Your culture is always public, and it's your most powerful public-facing asset or liability." And I think this quote is just a great reminder for us all of how connected our organisational cultures are to our brands, and our brands to our audiences or consumers. All those things are interconnected. And as I said a minute ago, I think there was definitely a time, and some people still think this way, where organisational culture or culture change was seen as soft things, as internal things, as nice to have things if we can get to that further down the line, and maybe not as important as strategy. But I do think that's changing. And I think what we've been through with COVID is accelerating that change and moving it further up the agenda. So in order to change the culture of an organisation, we all know we've got to pull many levers and deploy a variety of informal and formal interventions to influence behaviours and form new habits. Culture change is notoriously hard to measure, and everyone knows it takes a lot of time, especially if you're an organisation that has been around for a long time. So to give you a bit more context about where we are in news right now, we're in the midst of a very ambitious modernisation plan, primarily to ensure we deliver more value for our audiences. And we've got 3 main cultural aims with that. So operating in an audience-first manner, all collaborating under the BBC master brand, and creating an inclusive culture. So I'm going to keep it simple now, as we've only got a tiny bit of time, and talk through 3 practical interventions. We all know leadership is paramount to any successful culture change. And it's vital that our leaders are role modelling the behaviours that we and habits that you are trying to form. We also know it's important that they're driving the changes that we're putting in place. I think we all agree that the notion of leadership has changed over a period of time. I know I grew up with, and we probably all grew up with, the notion that leaders are supposed to know it all and show no emotion. That is definitely different now. You've got people like author and organizational psychologist Adam Grant saying we should all embrace the power of what we don't know, and Simon Sinek saying, be the idiot in the room. And these are not throwaway comments. They're very much to aim to encourage us all to question things, be curious, and make sure we don't go down the groupthink route. And that we create a more inclusive culture, so listening to more of those voices and views around the table. So over the last 5 years, I've been running a number of leadership programs with three main aims: to identify the leaders of the future, to instill a modern approach to leadership, so things like adopting a growth mindset, valuing emotional intelligence, as well as new ideas and perspectives, and developing a learning culture. And lastly, to diversify the leadership pipeline, which, as we all know, is absolutely essential to our success. So in terms of how the programs work, we basically select really diverse cohorts of people, diverse in every way. We set a really clear target that 75% of the people on the program have to move into new roles a year after the end of the program. And basically, if we don't meet that, we will not run that program again, because I really don't believe in programs for programs' sake. I think the movement metric for us is really, really important, because at the BBC, I know you were just talking about retention. We have a very quite a low churn rate, because people come, they love working for the BBC, and they stay with us. So it can be hard to move around. So that's why that's one of the aims that we have. And in terms of changes we've seen, we've had more than 200 people come through our programs now, with both their teams and managers saying that they've come back with a totally new approach to work and adopted new leadership styles. We've linked the people from our programs to our succession plans, which is really, really important to us. And more than 80% of the people on the programs have now moved into new roles. And then in terms of diversity, we've increased the number of women in senior leadership roles from 26 to 42%, and the number of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds in leadership roles from 11 to 20%. So we are starting to see some of those results. And in addition to this, I'm a big believer in the power of storytelling. And I think leadership storytelling and role modeling is kind of woven into everything we do, whether it's hearing from external leaders or telling the story of our own leaders who are blazing a trail. And the people on our programs often talking about passing it back, which is this quote that I've just put there, the kind of pay it back mentality, which is built into all of our programs. So we invest in them, they're then investing in other people, causing that ripple effect. However, a purely top-down approach rarely works. It's really critical, as we all know, to communicate horizontally as well. Sometimes your greatest ambassadors and most untapped resources are your change agents, positive disruptors, and leaders that sit further down the organization. I'm a big believer that leaders are not just the people at the top. I think they're the people anywhere in your organization that have that ability to influence or galvanize people and make change happen. So that's why we created Culture Champions, which is the second thing I was going to talk about today. So these are people that we've appointed at different levels throughout News who can act as ambassadors of our values. They act as go-to people in teams, and they're there to talk about issues and opportunities, creating another layer of psychological safety for people and empowering people to make changes in their own areas. We give them development opportunities to kind of incentivize them and reward what they're doing for us. But actually, a lot of people are inspired to get involved just by being part of the change. So I've got a couple of quotes here that just bring to life, I hope, for some of you who maybe don't work in news, just newsrooms can be really tough environments. I was actually just talking to Oriana about this when we get into our conversation, but they can be really tough cultures to operate in. There's a huge amount of deadlines, things happening now. You're dealing with sometimes incredibly difficult stories. And you can see there that wasn't historically, these conversations around well-being or around culture were not top of the agenda. And hopefully we're definitely shifting the dial on that now. And actually, I recently just touched base with one of my colleagues in the Delhi Bureau, and you all know what horrific time people are having in India right now. He is one of our culture champions, and he was saying he kind of agonized over whether he's created this thing called Your Story, which is about people sharing their personal stories in order to create a more inclusive environment. And he agonized whether to do it because of how challenging things are over there. But he decided to go ahead, and he just said the power of people sharing their stories was just unbelievably impactful for the teams over there. So I know that's incredibly simple, but sometimes the most simple things are the most impactful. And that's just one example. So our ambition now is to create a much larger network of culture champions, which we're just about to start doing across BBC News. And that's going to be a really integral part of delivering our modernisation plans. And then finally, young people have a huge amount of passion, untapped ideas, creativity, and aspiration for how they want things to be. And tapping into that and unlocking that within your workforce can be hugely powerful. So about 4 years ago, I created the first BBC News panel for younger colleagues in the organisation, and its aims were threefold: to get young voices heard at the most senior level in the organisation, to break down hierarchies and bridge the gap between colleagues and senior management, and to get young colleagues inputting on business, strategic and editorial decisions. And I think it's been just hugely useful to us. Firstly, those younger people are closer to the young audiences we're trying to reach in BBC News, so they can bring insights to that. And secondly, they represent the workforce of the future, so it's invaluable from both editorial and cultural perspective. And we had so much interest from younger colleagues. We've actually had to create a network which has more than 1,000 of our younger colleagues as part of it. And every week, younger people in the organisation come to our weekly Next Gen editorial meetings to input on our editorial decisions. And the panel has now been replicated across the BBC, and our Director General has his own Next Generation panel as well. So these are just some of the things that we have done, and they're part of a much wider strategic culture change effort. But hopefully that's just given a few discussion points for us. And I thought I'd end with this quote from Francesca Gino, who I interviewed as part of my speaker series last year, which I just really like. She wrote a book called Rebel Talent. And she says, culture change takes patience and persistence. Find people who will come on your journey with you, ignore the barriers and break your own ceiling. And I think if you haven't read a book, there's lots of good advice in there. So hopefully, Oriana, we've got some time for questions.
We do. We've got about 10 minutes. So send them as and when to people watching. I've got a few myself in the meantime. How has the BBC adapted its culture in the last 12 months?
So it's been, as for everyone, massively kind of challenging and fascinating time. I was just remembering yesterday, the day we locked down, and that night, the night the Prime Minister kind of made his announcement, and we were all not knowing when we were going to be in the office again. And I wrote immediately got to writing like guides on how we were going to manage remote working and working from home, and devising events that would bring people together and connect people. We launched work from home mentors. We launched special sessions for parents and carers. You know, I'm a parent of 2 little boys, and there were different challenges for people in different life stages. So we were trying to create that kind of sense of support and well-being for people immediately, but also give people the tools. You know, lots of people had never worked from home before, and this sudden environment, you know, obviously there was the technical and operational challenges, but then there was also just how do you help people work from home? And then a huge percentage of our workforce carried on coming in, because as you can imagine, we had to keep the kind of literally the show on the road and the programs on air. And if you were a studio director or a presenter, or your role required you to be in the office, those people were coming in, and we were delivering a really vital service, making sure people were getting, you know, the information they needed at such a, you know, scary time.
I mean, you forget how new this all was just like a year ago.
Absolutely.
I mean, what can leaders do when there's resistance to change within their workforce?
So I think you always get resistance to change. I think you have to expect that when you embark on any change program. But I always see it as a spectrum. So you immediately can think, right, I've got a lot of people over here. The positive, start with the positive, which is there's a lot of people who are like very open-minded, excited about change, and are going to jump on anything that gives them that ability to kind of drive things into the future. So the first thing is to tap into them. And then that's a bit what we're trying to do with our culture champions, is they're already really excited and tapped into wanting to make things better. So working with them. Then you've got the people in the middle who you can bring along that journey. They're really, really kind of porous, and you probably can explain things to them and bring them along. And then you've got the people at the far end who are unlikely to immediately come on this journey, but I often find them more in the minority. And I think the key is if you can focus on your change makers and your middle, then you're going to make a lot of change. And then you really want to try and speak to those people and explain the reason and the purpose and why you are making that change. It goes back to the power of why. What's the destination? What's the reason? For us, it's always our audiences and how we can serve our audiences better. But I always say you may not be able to bring all of those people with you, but that's the best way to, I think, approach it.
And what about people that have been in your organisation for a substantial amount of time, particularly maybe your white male leaders who feel like they're being sidelined a little bit? How do you bring them along on that journey?
Sure. So we have a lot of people, as I said, who've been at the BBC for a long time. And it is because they just love the brand and believe in it and that sense of real purpose. They're really, really driven by what we do and the journalism that we provide. In terms of bringing people with you, again, I think it just goes back to the why. You've got to, in the end, everything we do is about making sure, future-proofing the BBC and making sure we are going to be there in years to come. And for other businesses listening to that, that's going to be the same, is that how do we make sure we're here in 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years? And the way that you do that is you've got to be looking at, okay, how are we engaging our audiences, or for others of you, consumers? What are we doing around that? Where are we not doing well enough? And once you explain that case for change, I think it's really hard for people to not, at the very least, understand why you're doing it, even if it's slightly painful sometimes, the changes that you are bringing about. And then on your question on, perhaps male leaders, I actually think, again, it's more about saying, I find it sometimes more useful to talk about culture change than to talk about diversity, because lots of people hear the word diversity and they think of it as minority groups, even though, as we all know, women are not a minority group, but they get listed in this kind of, people see it through the prism of targets. And actually that sometimes can be really unhelpful. Whereas when you talk about it, about creating a really inclusive, diverse culture that we can all be part of and all thrive in, that can sometimes be a better approach to bring everyone on that journey with you.
Thanks. And one of our readers, they want to know, or viewers, as part of your D&I strategy, do you also look at socioeconomic background?
Yes, we do. And we're actually in the midst of a piece of work on that right now. We have a very active and wonderful internal staff network called Raised that is brilliantly run and chaired, and they are looking at this. And Tim Davey, our Director General, has announced that we will be kind of coming out with targets around socioeconomic background, so you can look out for that. We will be coming out with that soon, but it's something we try and take into consideration anyway. Certainly when we're looking at our apprenticeships and trainees, we're looking at socioeconomic background already, and we also look at that when we're kind of putting our programs together, looking at the mix of people's backgrounds.
And someone else has, commended the risk journalists are taking currently in Jerusalem and around the world. But how do you keep in contact with said journalists who are abroad, and how do you support them?
It's really tough. And I think there's no doubt when you're in, like I was mentioning, the Delhi Bureau right now, and it just really, is so awful what they're going through right now. And that happens at different points. You have different points in the world where people are going through huge amounts of challenges, and you worry, you feel like you're really far away. But I think one of the positives of COVID for global organizations, and we have certainly seen this, is that our colleagues in bureaus feel more connected than before. So when we're running these events, and we run lots of different events, whether it's a speaker series with external leaders or the kind of remote working events we were running earlier in the year, people were obviously dialing in and everyone was equally in the room. Whereas before, everyone felt like they were in London or Salford and anyone outside of that was dialing in. And I think that's one of the things that's been kind of great at democratizing our access to things and bringing us a bit closer together. So that's something we really, really want to retain, not just with our global colleagues, but with our kind of all around the UK colleagues as well.
And finally, I think this is probably going to be the last question because we're running out of time. Culture measurement is obviously quite hard to measure. You talked about the movement metrics. What else are you using as a proxy indicator on your success?
Yeah, so I mean, I speak to all my counterparts in other organizations about this, and I'm always saying, how are you measuring things? What are you doing? Because I think it's still something that organizations are trying to get better at. But I think obviously if we all believe that culture change is kind of intrinsically part of meeting your strategic objectives or your business objectives. So your business objectives are a measure of how successful your kind of culture is. So that's something to look at. And then a lot of people do, I don't want to say the dreaded surveys word, but surveys and pulse surveys. So shorter ones that are just a few questions every week or every other week, where you can really just do a bit of a litmus test on how people are feeling, what they're thinking about, rather than the really long, heavy ones where people are kind of sometimes get put off by them and they don't always give you a sense, because it's just a moment in time. And if you only do it every 6 months or once a year, you're really not getting much of a sense. Whereas those quick pulse surveys can be better if you do that over a period of time and have a baseline that you're going from. And then I do think qualitative measures are really important too. I know we all want numbers and data and stats, but getting that feedback where people are saying, I did this and the knock-on effect was that, and that's the storytelling aspect, I think is hugely valuable, and we shouldn't lose sight of how important that is in this piece as well.
And how often would you recommend doing, these surveys?
I think it's different for different. I think it's really different. Depends what you're doing already. But I think certainly once a month, quick check-in would be a really positive thing to do. But devising those questions incredibly carefully, and also realizing, taking into consideration external context. I'm sure we all would have seen people struggling more this year in the light of COVID with work than perhaps in other points. I certainly was, when I was desperately trying to homeschool, work, and exist.
Oh my God, same, but it's hopefully easing up now and some normality is returning.
Absolutely. I think we all need that, don't we?
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Katie. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. There were a couple of other questions, so I'll send them to you.
Yeah, please do.
Have those answered.
Yeah.
And stay tuned for the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Oriana.
Thank you, Katie.